I want to thank everyone for joining and for giving for taking the time to hear about the governance principles and where we want to take governance in the future from Australian Sports Commission perspective. I did want to start off by just talking about governance, and it's one of those things that has been around since around the late 1990s, when we had the major corporate disasters in the US with Enron and WorldCon, where there was fraud that actually took those companies down. And I think from that point on, we've seen an evolution of governance over a long period of time in business. And probably more recently, over the last 10 years or so, we've started to see, much more adoption of governance principles and processes by sporting organisations, because organisations are organisations, whether they're business or whether they're sport or whether they're both. I often get asked, because governance is one of those things, it's one of those words. It's a bit like, for those that are old enough to know, when Y2K was happening back in 2000, as to, well, what actually is it? And governance is a bit the same. I recall in my time working for Ernst & Young, we had one of the top 50 CFOs come and talk to us about governance. And I remember he stood up and said, "I've been asked to talk about governance, but I actually don't have a clue what it's about." And I think that's been something that we've used the words and no one's really understood what it is. In my opinion, everyone will give you different views, but what governance is about how to make decisions and how to take actions and processes. I should confess, and I won't use the club name, but I was a director for 15 years on a Melbourne-based AFL club, and we had no governance processes in place. And at the time that I got involved, and what we ended up with over a period of time was, in that sporting club, was we ended with a very focused board. We ended up with an audit committee, which was we brought in some specialist skills just to focus in that area. We had a separate risk committee, which had separate specialist skills with that area. So, and again, all feeding up into the board. We had a football subcommittee, again, just understanding where football was going. So you can see the different things. It enabled us to have independence. It enabled us to have expertise, and it fitted in with our overall strategy. So even at club level, I've been involved with sports where you may not have a meeting every other month, but you will do a risk assessment, and you will have some people who just focus on that, and an audit committee and a finance committee. But what it does is it enables the board to receive experts' opinions, an independent view, and an independent thought in being able to, how do we make decisions and how do we go forward? I think the evolution, as we'll come to, have been around things like diversity, the whole independence, specialist skills, and bringing those all to the board to help them make decisions. It doesn't need to be complicated, and I think that's a message I do want to get across. So if I refer to the screen, I just wanted to cover really quickly just how the evolution of our governance principles have evolved, since 2012, when they were first established, through to the new principles of 2019, 2020. And I think, as we'll show in the next few slides, as to how we actually develop these principles, that we will continue to update them over time. These are not static. Governance is a flowing process, and making sure that the organisation, adapts to change and continues to bring the whole of the sport, the whole of the club, to the discussion, so that we can cover off on many of those issues that may impact our decision making. We go to the next slide, please, Mon. So this slide really just covers, what we've done and why we've done it. So, we've had some recent things that have changed. We've ended up with a 2030 sports strategy, which has been adopted by the Sports Commission and the Minister. We've had a much evolving state in terms of business. If you think about things like cybersecurity, we're all in our businesses, we're all being impacted by that. I know personally, my father has been in a nursing home, and that nursing home got hacked, where all of the details of all the patients got released into the internet, and those sorts of things, and that can easily happen to any of us from a sport perspective. So we really wanted in this process, we wanted to make sure that we've had our stakeholders had a real opportunity to participate in what a real proactive and practical set of governance principles really did look like. We wanted our stakeholders told us that they wanted Sport Australia to drive this and not have the leakage of the information go outside to other consultants. We wanted to be self-contained and bring all of the information into our sector and not have it walk out the door. We wanted to make sure that we offered range and flexibility in the way that stakeholders contribute. So we'll talk about that in the next slide. But the diversity in how we did that across the group, and particularly with the advent of COVID and not being able to meet personally, meant that was really important for us to do and to bring all stakeholders to the table. Absolutely critical that we had diverse voices. This is not just about having people that are in sport, but also having some experts outside of the sport to give a different view. Business people who might be able to bring a different perspective, as well as experts in the field of governance. And we wanted to make sure that we had some timely and value-adding data capture and analysis. Data analysis is certainly something that most organisations are doing, and we wanted that to be timely. We didn't want this just to be we had a chat to a few people. We wanted to make sure that we were able to incorporate. And finally, the process of creating the framework was to be purposeful and structured, and a structured engagement strategy. So so we're all on board. There's nothing worse in the sports sector where we've got people who are embedded in it and have been embedded in it for a long time, for them not to really engage in our strategy. So that's how we came up with it. We were wanting to make sure that we understood those issues facing sports, that we brought inside, and we were able to make this an evolutionary process. You move on to the next slide. Thanks, Mon. So very quickly, the evolution process, we did do the face-to-face co-designing, with some of our stakeholders, including all of the states and territory sport and rec departments, who've been fantastic in supporting this initiative, and we thank them for their contribution and their guidance and independence over and helping us to do this. We've also held those workshops in each state and territory, and we brought in the directors and executives of the NSOs and SSOs to make sure that we captured that broad range. I think the outcomes, quite clearly, and everybody will be in agreement with this, is just a lack of resources to be able to put these things in place. And I think, if I think back to my time as a sportsman and coaching a team, I almost felt like I was the president, the treasurer, the ground sweeper, and the coach. So, we are all limited for resources, and our volunteers are being challenged, in terms of their capacity and wanting to continue to be involved, particularly during COVID. So, the lack of resources is something we don't want to be reinventing the wheel every time we want to try and do something that might be innovative or something that might be protecting the organisation or the club. We also ran 14 online jams, again with distance, with country regions. The online, as we've seen in the last 6 months, our online presence is now much stronger than it's ever been, and the online jams gave us that opportunity to be able to bring people in, into the discussion without physically having to be there. And I think that's been a terrific initiative that we've done. What our stakeholders wanted was principles to help improve their organisations, guidance on how to evaluate governance, but most importantly, they wanted director education. And I think, in my experience, being a former state sporting organisation presence, the turnover of some of our people, directors, for whatever reason, we're asking volunteers to do a lot of work, and it's really important that we have that induction process, that education process, to help our incoming directors understand, what governance is, what the structures we have, and so to that end, we really wanted to have that education program, but also to have some ongoing resources and guidelines and templates that our clubs and our sports could activate to help them each year. What we didn't want to create a dust gathering War and Peace, turn to Chapter 6. These are principles that have been designed with our language, with sporting language as much as possible, with everyday language, not language that we can't understand, and a methodology and templates that are actually easily understandable and implementable. The final thing we did was our sport governance team, worked with the sector to develop a governance framework, which linked all of those things, which linked an education system, evaluation, the assurance improvement, and the education programs that we wanted to be able to bring to the table. So, we've gone outside. We haven't just taken that information, created ourselves. We've also challenged to get some experts who told us in some cases that some of the stuff we were putting together wasn't relevant, or wasn't practical, or wasn't really what we wanted to be doing from a practical guide. So we have gone through an exhaustive process. So, Mon, if you could flick to the next one, please. Okay, so the framework that we've come up with is the principles, which we'll get onto in a second. And I do encourage you to read them. They're great reading. They're really simple and actionable. So please read those. And that is the first part of the framework, the education and learning, so that our directors and in some cases our future directors have got that opportunity to learn those courses. We've got an evaluation and assurance process so that we can measure, and we've also got support around the framework with our sport advisory team who are always available to help you walk through this process and get things set up. Next slide, thanks, Mon. So something that I did want to talk about is certainly in my experience, and for those that don't know, I took on this role as acting chief executive for a couple of months while there was a search process going on to find a new CEO. COVID happened, and we're well and truly past the 6-month point, and I'm certainly going to be sticking around for a little bit longer whilst we get through this. But it became really obvious that to me that things have shifted so much in the sports sector, and we've got some challenges as custodians of our sports and of our sporting sector to really leave the sport when we do to leave it to our next generation. And it's really clear to me, and we won't go into detail, but we have got some challenges. We've got duplication of effort across the sector. We haven't really sat down with each other and actually worked out, who should be doing what, who's the best position to do what, and we have got, some real challenges with the conflict that we've created between ourselves, whether that be through club, state, or the national sporting organisation, and that can only be dealt with by us. We can't bring people in, and when I mean us as the custodians of the sport. So I really challenge everybody. It is an opportunity. The best time to do change is in a crisis, but don't just immediately keep doing what we're doing. Let's challenge to see if we can get better. Sport is going to be, as every sector of our community is going to be, under enormous pressure to pay back the debt that we have created through COVID. So our sector is not going to be immune to that, and we're going to need to make sure that we're efficient and effective. Above all, the challenges that we do have, and having spoken to every sport across all 99 sports, is the one thing that people are really concerned about is that participants won't come back to sport, that they've found some extra time, and that they'll find a more passive way or a social sport to actually play the game, rather than coming back to the sport that they've always participated in. And of course, the other aspect of that is our volunteers. You know, we are absolutely desperate to have our volunteers, and we are seeing a drop off. There are sports where, you know, particularly through the COVID time, that volunteers don't want to return back to their sporting clubs. So they're the things that are really, really important. So again, it's a challenge to all of you to actually take on this responsibility and try and you know, work together as a sport to bring out to come up with some innovative ideas as to how we go forward. So next slide, thanks, Mon. Just the start line, and I think I experienced this back in 2002 when I started in the AFL at the AFL club, where we had nothing in place, and it is really difficult to start because you're implementing new structures and new processes, and people are always concerned about that. If I can just stand back and just talk in sport versus in business, you will find we have unique structures. We have a hybrid federated model for a start, where we have our clubs, we have our states, and our states own our national sporting organisations. Now that's a hybrid federated model versus a true federated model, whereas our members are the ones that actually own the national sporting organisation and the state sporting organisation. So we have got some unique structures. What I found, certainly being involved with football, was that we had more history and tradition around the football side than we did around the business side. So things like the History and Tradition Committee, you know, was actually a well-respected committee, but it didn't add anything. It was all about the past, as opposed to thinking about the future and the risks that might hurt us as an organisation. So make sure you take those into consideration, and don't set unrealistic deadlines around how to create these things, because they will evolve, and sometimes it just takes a little bit of time to ease into it. I know in my case, you know, the football committee was something that we didn't have, and we needed to have to actually bring the administration and the football side of the business together. One thing that I know all of you would have experienced in being in administration of sport is passion. And I've seen in my experience at state sporting organisations and national sporting organisations, and I know we've got some panel members here today who can talk about it, but passion and the high performance aspect, you know, that in I've seen you know, some pretty significant and well credentialed business people who have just you know, been reduced to rubble when it comes to dealing with their superhero sportsmen. So, you know, something that we do need to be aware of is that when people get involved with sport, they want to be involved with sport, not necessarily the administration. So it's important to have really robust processes to make sure everyone focuses on their role and not someone else's role. And I think the other thing is we've got a variety of purposes within sport. You know, a single organisation can have multiple tasks. For instance, you know, you might have a foundation which supports some charities. You may have your high performance, and of course you've got your administration side of things as well. And I've been involved with organisations which have had other commercial interests as well to be able to feed into the high performance sector. So just remember that. Next slide, Mon. So I'm going to move through these the principles, and I will ask all of you to you know, to go through them. But the first one that is really critical is a values-driven culture and behaviours. If you don't have a consistent set of values, and these do not need to be complicated, but in any organisation you're going to have, in any sporting organisation, you will have a high-performance arm and you will have an administration arm. It's absolutely critical that you set those values and behaviours and cultures that you want across both, or across all of the sectors of the organisation. When they're not aligned, they will not be implemented successfully. So if I can ask you to make sure that you've got that, and ask all of your stakeholders as to what our values and what our cultures are within the organisation, because that will set the standard. Next principle, thanks, Mon. I think that the concept of the team is really important, and it goes back to what I was talking about before. You know, as an organisation, we have got 3 layers. I really encourage you to be aligned. There are very few of our sports which have got aligned strategies, so one strategy for our sport I think it's absolutely critical, and there can be subcomponents within each state. But I think it is really important to have that alignment, and particularly through a collaborative governance. If we don't talk to each other, we just don't know what's going in our organisations, and that is absolutely critical. So principle 3 is the game plan, and this is, you know, otherwise known as our strategy plan, and every organisation has them, whether they be on 2 pages or 10 pages. It's really clear that good organisations have a purpose, and everybody understands what that purpose is, and whether that's to, you know, organisation-wide or it's an outcome focus, it doesn't need to be complicated, but we need to have a strategy and we need to be driving towards something. What I find in the sports sector is, because we have very few volunteers and we have a lot of roles, often we just get involved with doing rather than setting a strategy and driving towards it, whether that be increase in participation, increase in knowledge, increase in experience, or increase in fun. But we really should know what we're about and what we are trying to do. Principle 4, thanks, Mon, are the players. And I think that, you know, this is really important. Diversity is absolutely critical. If I go back to my my football days in 2002, we had 9 directors, 9 men, 9 white males. We had 25,000 supporters. And at the time, we had no diversity whatsoever, and yet our membership base was very diverse. Fast forward 15 years, and we've now got 5 females on the board. We've got multicultural, and we've got 105,000 members of a massive different demographic, and absolutely critical that we're able to understand that demographic. So if I can challenge you to bring different thinking to the board, and if not through the board, through the subcommittees, being able to understand, you know, the different knowledge. I remember the catch cry of my football club was "Eat 'em alive," and that was fine for men. But when we end up with 50% of our female members, we needed a different catch cry to be able to really appeal to future members. And so now we have around 4 of our positioning statements which cater for younger people, older people, you know, for non-Australian gender, for non-Australian, and of course for females as well. So consider that when you're looking at the compositions of your board. Principle 5, thanks, Mon. Really quickly, you can't have an effective board unless everyone has a scope and a scope to follow in what their roles and their responsibilities are. Okay, the one thing you don't want is you don't want to have a board member who's running off talking to the coach about picking the team. Okay, so it is really critical to make sure that you've got some alignment around what are the rules of your directors and your subcommittees, and what you do and don't want to have. But those rules and those powers and responsibilities, absolutely critical. Principle 6, thanks, Mon. The playbook, and I think this is obviously another really critical component. The processes which ensure accountability and transparency. There is nothing more important than having a transparent board that you can talk honestly and openly to your members, and making sure that you've got some accountability within what you're being asked to do. There's no point saying that to your members, we just didn't do things. You need to set a standard, you need to deliver on that standard, you need to report to that standard. And so those principles which are outlined are really, really clear. Principle 7. The defence. I talked before about our risk assessment, and again, with many smaller of our club and community teams, you know, this often doesn't take a lot of risk, but just more often around safety, around child safety, you know, protection of members, all of those sorts of things, and often understanding how you deal with those things. You know, what is our system of defence to ensure the integrity of the club is maintained? Because you only get one dose of integrity, and absolutely critical that we as a board, and when we're dealing with governance, that we understand, you know, how we are going to protect the organisation. So a really important thing for you to talk to your board members about. Principle 8 is the best and fairest, which again is is in talking about integrity and how we can proactively deal with the challenges that occur, reflected by a positive reputation in the community. Okay, it's really important we have a message that aligns with our culture, with our values, and we want that message to be into the community as well. And it drives participation. It drives future members. You know, to have that reputation about being a good, honest citizen and being able to deliver the right things and a great place for people to enjoy and have fun. So it's a system that protects the organisation, and it is about us being the best we can be and the fairest that we can be. And finally, Principle 9, which is our scorecard. And as a board, I think this is probably the hardest thing that I ever found in the boards that I've been on, whether they be in business or not, because we have elected directors and in some cases appointed directors, is how do you measure people's performance? You know, and how honest do you do that? You know, do you call people in and you know, you have ways of being able to measure their performance? It is a really critical component, because to have an effective board, you need 9 or however many members you have on the board, you need them to be all participating. And where you've got some people that aren't living up to their expectations or the board's expectations, it's really important to bring that to their attention. But this is one of those emotive aspects on how the board performs, on how the board can improve, and how individuals can actually you know, contribute to the outcome that the board wants and to the role that the members wanted them to be in.